So I believe we are live. I'm delighted to be here this evening. My name is Lorraine Maher, and I'm currently artist in residence at Access in Ballymun. I have been involved in Access now for over 5 years. When I first came to Access, I brought a project that I was working on, which was a photographic exhibition called #IamIrish. And I felt so welcome to be able to bring that into the space at Access. It became like a home away from home for me. And I was delighted to be accepted as an artist in residence, funded by the Arts Council Ireland. You'll probably hear from my accent, I have spent a lot of time outside of Ireland. I currently live in London, but I work between here and Ireland, mainly in Dublin. And I've been doing a lot of work around identity and belonging, access. You know, for me, I smile because I'm really spending this time at Access in Ballymun, looking at access to arts and culture in Ireland. And as part of this exploration, I wanted to create a space that was kind of public and really transparent, a way to be able to engage people in the wider conversation. And, you know, in exploring the social and cultural implications of othering in the arts and wanting to create a dialogue around inclusion and representation and really looking at what that is. So over the next 8 weeks, I'm giving you an opportunity to come on this journey with me. And, you know, this is about having a creative conversation, the start of conversations, and actually, hopefully, a spark that will help us to be more creative in the way that we work, to think about how you might work, to think about how we create greater representation for people. So I'm delighted to be joined this evening by an incredible artist, and I will hand over for him to introduce himself. Over to you.
Hey, hiya. So I'm Dylan. I'm a playwright and I write under my own name, and I work collaboratively with a company called MALAPROP, who've been around since 2015. And I think in both those types of work, I'm sort of interested in doing stuff that's nerdy but has a heart. I think when we write applications, what we always say is we aim to be as compassionate as we are cerebral, which I think makes some people tick some boxes and everything. And then the other thing I do all the time as well is I work a lot with young people and in communities. And I think sometimes there's some preconceptions around that word, you know, in terms of community art and the like. So I think sort of the catch-all term I like for all of the stuff that happens, not always in a theatre, but maybe in association with the theatre, but certainly in a community and working with professionals. I think the catch-all I like for that is situated. I really like working in situations with people or sharing people's situation for a bit and trying to make a work that responds to that. So yeah, sort of local, but in a good way. And that's my thing.
Yeah, you know what? It's really interesting even hearing you say that, Dylan, because when we think about like youth arts or we think about participatory art, it feels like somewhere along the line, it has almost like in some people's eyes, less of a value, even though the work is the same. And actually, I think sometimes like in my day job in the UK, I work in arts and criminal justice, and I work with some incredible women who are seen as non-actors. But actually, when I think about the work that they produce, and actually, even when I look at, you know, when we look at Access and we access arts and we look at the work that takes place there with communities, and sometimes you think actually we even expect more from those communities than we do from professional actors, because, you know, with professional actors, there's a framework in place. So there's working hours are regulated, the way that we, you know, that we work is regulated, but actually, with community arts and participatory arts, people give so much of themselves and so much of their lived experience. And, you know, one of the things I've been thinking about a lot when I'm thinking about myself is who am I as a creative? Like, who am I as an artist? And even what is an artist? So I'm going to even ask you, Dylan, you know, when you think about being an artist, what does being an artist mean to you? I've been asking everyone this question recently.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm not being glib if I say it can't be about pay. I mean, there's the obvious joke there because so much of the work we do isn't paid or isn't paid well enough. But I think there's a deeper and a realer thought there, which is that essentially you're not an artist because someone is prepared to say so, because someone is prepared to believe you if you write it on your CV. There's lots of people who are amateur artists, but that's not lesser. That's just a different mode of making, and I think making is the central thing there, which comes back to that thing about professionalism. And I totally agree with what you're saying there about sometimes things being higher stakes or realer or rawer in stuff that's ostensibly lesser, or and sometimes is less polished because there's less money sometimes in sort of the thing you do with your group who you meet on a Friday rather than the thing that's in the West End. But I think like if particularly in theatre, if what you're interested in is humans and human nature and sort of how complex they are and how difficult it is to say truthful things about what it is like to be someone, actually sometimes the rawness is a virtue. Polish isn't the only thing to be interested in. There's something really interesting about working with people who don't do it all the time but have a really strong drive to. And so I think maybe the drive is more fundamental than the interest in getting paid or in the interest in doing it all the time. So like I'm a professional artist and actually I do lots of other things that aren't my art, but they all feed it. And I think it's more about that drive or that goo, that every so often you're just like, oh, I'd love to write a poem, or oh, I'd love to be in a show, or oh, I'd love to. And maybe it's because doing those things allows us to, I suppose, reflect in a way that's really valuable on the world we're in, and we sort of get handed and our place in it, and the things we can do about that, and the things we can't but wish we could, and art as being a really good forum for all that. If that's an answer.
No, that's a perfect answer. I just want to invite anyone that is listening into the conversation tonight to join us in the conversation, because like I said, this is kind of exploration, and it's a thought process, and you're part of that. So do feel free to leave comments, leave us questions, and make sure to share the chat. We're really excited this evening because this is like the start of Access bootleg season. And we're the first show, although you might feel like it's a show. Dylan and I were just saying before we came on, I feel like we should have been doing something creative, but actually this is creative. These kind of conversations are what helps us as creatives to think about the work that we want to bring. And Dylan, one of the things that I think, like for me, what is fundamental is people. It's how I create with people. It's that collaboration. It's about the storytelling. And what feels really exciting is that, particularly when I think about home, when I think about Ireland, like everybody is an artist. Everybody, like I think about when did I become an artist? And I realized that I never actually put that label on myself. Like I never put the artist label on myself. Other people put that on me. And it felt like a normal process. And as a child, actually, like I'm dyslexic, and going to school, like the written word, the way that my brain worked, my brain worked in a different way, in a really creative way. And so actually it was really natural for me, and is really natural for me to think in a creative way. So I'm just wondering about you as an artist. How do you describe yourself? And what's the process that you went on to get to where you are now? And I'm just interested in hearing all of that, Dylan.
No, yeah, I mean that goes really deep, because in a way it's very on theme, because it's about identity. Is an artist something you are, or is art something you do? Is it an essence or a practice? Like, is it always in you even when you're not doing it, or is it only there when you're doing it? And then is it something you have to sort of, a potter's wheel, you have to spin it every day, or actually it stops being a pot and just starts being loads of splats all over the place? I mean, I definitely feel more comfortable saying I write things than saying I am a writer. Partly because, again, writing's a funny one, because it's the discipline that's most closely sort of tied in people's minds to canons and sort of this idea of authority and producing works of, sort of enduring and objective value, which is the sort of the thing I'm least interested in doing. Whereas, like writing as a practice or a thing you do every day, rather than being a writer, that sort of works for me, because that feels more like it's therapeutic, or it's about the process and about seeing what emerges from it, and then how you can feed that back in, and who else you can encompass, who you can write with. So having said all that, I think, like, I don't know, maybe I should call myself a writer more, because I think I'm relatively rare amongst the theatre writers anyway that I know, and that I really, really enjoy writing. I think most playwrights I know really like having written plays, but I think to find the bit where you actually have to sit down and make stuff up a bit traumatic. And so, like, I've loads of sort of friends who do the same thing as me, who you just never ask about their work, which is a shame, because I think it's so interesting. I think particularly in the performing arts, the way you get to you get handed this sort of page full of dots, in terms of there's got to be this many people. We probably want a bit where this person who's really good at speeches gets a speech. We want a bit so maybe where this person's really good at dancing gets to do a bit of a dance. I've got this really sexy lighting state that I'd like to break out, if we can find a reason to possibly do so. And then you sort of have to find the shape that enfolds all those things, and sort of ends up highlighting the experiences or the little human moments that you're most interested in. And I've always really liked writing. So I started doing it for fun through Dublin Youth Theatre with a bunch of my pals, some of whom I still work with. And it was quite natural, really, which was, I went to college to do something else and ended up just working, and then never really escaped, which I think lots of people will relate to. Theatre is not an art form is an art form that lots of people end up in sort of accidentally, if not quite against their will. And I'm one of them.
Yeah, no, I completely relate to that, because I know it was certainly an accident for me. But it's been a world that I love, because it's like going to work every day to do something that I would quite happily be doing for nothing. But I think that in some ways is part of our challenge, because we know that so many artists give of their time for free, whether that's going to run workshops, whether that is doing, performances or taking part in work because they really love it, and often working with really small budgets to create some really high quality work. And so there's two things. I just want you to remember that, because I want us to think about representation when we're looking at contemporary, arts and culture in Ireland. Representation feels like it's massive, but that feeds into, us actually wanting to do things for nothing, and the arts and culture being undervalued in lots of ways. So Dylan, before I go into the wide conversation, something you and I both have in common is that we, when we think about identity, I know that both of us identify as being Irish, but both of us also recognize that we are mixed. So for me, I am Irish, and my father was Nigerian, so I have Nigerian culture. Not culture, ancestry. I have Nigerian ancestry, and I think it's really important that I make the definition, because I didn't grow up with a Nigerian culture. I grew up with an Irish culture, and so when I'm thinking about the work that I create and the influence of the work that I create, it's important for me to think about that and why I feel like representation and inclusion is really important, particularly when I'm thinking about being Irish and Irishness. So Dylan, how do you identify?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really glad you started with the thing of, are you a writer or do you write? Because that's a little how I feel, because my family story is sort of a classic Irish one that way, which was my biological grandfather was Chinese, and we have no, I suppose, sort of familial connection to him, because my mother was adopted into a white family. and then sort of in an interesting way grew up for quite a lot of her life, I think, not knowing, and thought it was just a coincidence that when she was in the arts, that she kept getting these roles in plays as the Asian character. And so like I remember a conversation when I was 8 or 9 when my mom was like, by the way, your grandfather was Chinese. And that's sort of interesting because, you know, it's Ireland being Ireland, and I think whiteness in Ireland being constructed quite narrowly, you know, which is very, very small deviations from being, you know, sort of a particular curly-haired, blue-eyed, freckly archetype, although I do have the freckles.
Me too.
Makes people sort of pass comment much sooner than they do in other countries where they're more used to the idea of there being diaspora cultures and sort of a multicultural mesh. So it had come up, and I remember being a really small kid and people saying, you know, with varying levels of respect, what are you, in that way that people do, and sort of having to go, haha, I'm Irish, what a laugh. And then having to reappraise that when we sort of found out that that wasn't the case, that there was actually something going on. And it sort of just loomed larger with time. You know, your relationship to these things, or I know mine has, really changes. And that came from growing up and learning a bit more, I suppose, about the history of race in Ireland and how it intersects with institutions and sort of, I suppose, the ongoing struggle for things like adoptees' rights to, you know about themselves and to understand where they came from. And so I feel a bit weird claiming the title of mixed, even though it's factual in one way, even though I sort of feel a bit weird, you know, implying, you know, that there's such a thing as races to mix, you know, because that's a bit of a question mark, you know, if you get into the biology. But I think I tried to have a mixed race practice, you know, I tried to practice mixed raceness day by day, even, you know, as lots of, or 99% of the time, the world treats me as though I'm white. So I tried to come at it from a place of solidarity, which is, I suppose, my family story doesn't inside out rather than outside in. It's not something the world has imposed on me, but it's something that shapes how I want to relate to the world, which is in, I suppose, sort of like an anti-racist practice. And then, you know, is in my, in how I write, in, you know, sort of bearing witness to the mixed upness and the complexity and the hybridity of the world, and not sort of whitewashing over that and pretending things are more homogenous than they are or ever have been. I suppose in that way, like the thing that comes up for me most often is that weird little twinge in your attention when people talk about the time when Irish was all, or when the time when Irish people were all white, or the time when Ireland was all white, which is for lots of people supposedly before the 90s. And then for other people is like before the 60s. And both of those are really, really questionable sort of simplifications, because actually the people have been there all along. It's just that I suppose the families weren't legitimated in the way they now have the chance to be legitimated sometimes, if you're lucky, fingers crossed, you know? So that's sort of moved into the foreground in the things I'm interested in writing about for the next little while. That's the big answer. That's the big answer.
No, but it's a really interesting one. Before I respond, I just want to acknowledge that I've seen a couple of questions, and we will come back to them. But what was interesting for me, like when I first started talking to the Access about this residency, my main interest was about othering, particularly linked to the Irish census, because on the Irish census form, you can be white, and there's variations of white, including being a white traveller and a white other. Actually, it doesn't even, I don't know that it says white other, and I'm kind of wondering even what that is about. So you can be white, you can be black, you can be Black Irish, which actually is great to see that you can be Black Irish, you can be Asian Irish, or you can be other, mixed other. And what is the mixed other? And like the other is a real bear bug of mine, because the other always implies that you're never good enough, like you're never the main one, you're always the other. And I just started, you know, I wanted to really unpack that. Why are we seeing like two colors? So, you know, we've got, you can be white, black, or Asian. Which that in itself doesn't even make any sense to me. But I then became more frustrated when I started looking at the census in the UK and in the States, and kind of globally, because the reality is that the world perceives Ireland to equal white. You know, wherever you look, you see Irish people are white. There's never a space to be anything else. So I'm on a real campaign to all Afro-Irish outside of Ireland. Please ensure that you tick Black Irish on these forms, because, you know, anyway, there's a new form coming out in Ireland for 2021. And I feel really quite excited to see what's on that form. I know that there's a space on there called Time Capsule that you can add any other kind of information that you might want people to know in 100 years. And I think that there's, you know, that I feel kind of excited about that. But I'm really hoping that we start kind of looking at this, you know, how we're talking about people, what are the kind of narratives that we're feeding. And, you know, we've seen globally the Black Lives Matter movement. We've seen through COVID the massive inequalities that there are. And we also know that the arts has always led the way in terms of responding and bringing people together, bringing communities together. But I can't help thinking about the labels that continue to be on us, because even when we're thinking about Irish arts kind of globally, when we're thinking about Irish arts, when we see something that's on the bill and we know that it's coming from Ireland, like it was Irish music, like there is a perception about what that's going to be. And I'm wondering, like, how can we continue to create visibility without labeling people? What's your thoughts, Dylan?
I mean, without going off the deep end, I mean, I'm really struck by that, because that came up for, you know, me, but also my mother a little while ago, because the Arts Council started demographically tracking their peer panelists, and me and Veronica are both on that list. And they suddenly allowed you to state your ethnicity, which I think hadn't been a thing before, or hadn't when I was added to the list. And then all of a sudden we had this option to say, were we Asian or Irish, or Asian Irish, or some weird sort of list of subcategories, but which were quite coarse grained, in that, you know, there's lots of details go missing in the cracks between these boxes. You know, the boxes they put the labels on so as to, let's keep our metaphors in harness here. But and it was interesting, because I sort of looked at it and decided and ticked white in the end, because I felt for their purposes I'm culturally white, and I suppose I felt it was important that, you know, I not give them the impression that things were less homogenous than they were in the Irish arts, because things, whatever about Ireland as a whole, the Irish arts are still very monocultural, although that's changing really quickly and really excitingly. But my mom rang me to say sort of, what did you put down? And I said, white, and she said, I think I'm going to say I'm Asian. And I went, you should, because you are, you know. And in a way, I think because particularly her story as, you know, a generation of adoptees is a really important thing to recognize, you know, that people don't just become white because that's the background they've grown up in, you know, which is you're marked by the way people treat you or recognize you or cast you in the role of someone who's a bit funny or a bit something or a bit where you're from, you know. But yeah, no, I mean, and I sort of share maybe the skepticism or the need to question labels, because I've just been reading, and I really hope I'm not going to mix up his consonants now, but Ambalavana Sivanandan's book, or a collection of his essays from the 70s and 80s, and he's sort of writing from the thick of stuff, you know, protests in Brixton and everything, and then I suppose sort of Tory government's attempts to quell or co-opt or disperse or dissipate all of that angry political energy. And he's quite angry about ethnicity, because he sees ethnicity or the fissioning of sort of political blackness into all of these sort of micro categories as a way of dispersing the energy that we can all mass in order to affect change. And I was really struck, because early on in the collection I was reading, he talks about himself as a black person, although I think he's ethnically Tamil. So in one sense he's Asian, but in another sense, he identifies as black. And I don't think that's about the darkness of her skin or otherwise. I've never seen a picture of the man. I don't know what he looks like. Instead, I think it's about solidarity in the sense of shared woundedness, you know, which is the world treats you the way it treats me in some ways. We're not saying our experience is different, but we're tender in the same way, you know, which is when people knock off us, it hurts. We have, you know, sort of these sore spots from past encounters that we have to look after. And maybe if we stand side by side, we can help each other, you know, sort of not get hurt more. So I sort of think for him, identity is less about, you know, finding the perfect label, but about finding people who maybe share your frustration with labels, and with whom you can form community. So yeah, maybe for me, it's more about community, and in as much as labels are a means to the end of community, they're useful, but at the point where they're actually separating you out, that's the point where they get a bit sketch. That make sense?
Yeah, it does. I mean, because I've been thinking a lot about labels and what they mean, but I equally am aware that labels are often really important for people. I was speaking really recently to an editor of an LGBTQ magazine, and she was saying to me, like, you know, she's really proud of being called a queer woman. Like, she's really proud of that. And that label is something that she wants to, that, you know, that proudly wear. And I started thinking about myself, because I've often led by the thought that, you know, I identify as being a Black Irish woman, and that label has been politically important to me. Gabrielle has actually said, should we now start making the label Caucasian Irish? I'm not sure that that is the right label. And Gabrielle is saying, I have mixed heritage. However, I sincerely don't think anyone should be referred to by the color of their skin. And in lots of ways, I completely agree with that. But for the Black community, particularly in the UK, and I know in America, being Black is political, and people are proudly Black, and in lots of ways want to be identified in that way. In Ireland, I think that often people want to be referred to as people of African descent. And so it's not really that clear cut. And I think if we were to speak to people who do identify as being Caucasian, I don't know that they'd always want to be called Caucasian. I mean, I don't know, I can't really answer on behalf of other people, but I think that it's a conversation that needs, you know, we just need to be having those kind of conversations rather than thinking that there's a one cap that just fits all. You know, we know through research that 1 in 4 children born in Ireland today is born to a non-white Irish native. So we know that the population of Ireland is not what it might have been in the 1900s, although we do know that there were people who did also identify as coming from Asian, from African, from Indian descent in the 1900s. Like it's on the census, and we know through research that people have been in Ireland. You know, I know Black people have been in Ireland for centuries. It's not new, although you're right, Dylan, people think that we're still quite new. One of the things, I mean, I think that the conversation about labels is something that we'll continue to have over the weeks, because I'm really interested in just kind of unpacking that. Alison has asked us the question, has Zoom and the increase in digital theatre, etc., impacted on your work? Do you think it will promote inclusion in the Irish arts overall? So Dylan, I'll bring that question to you before I respond.
I mean, yeah, huge effect. MALAPROP had a show put on ice at the start of lockdown, and we're very lucky that we're presenting something as part of the pilot light edition of the Fringe Festival this year. So that's coming up. As you know, where lockdown sort of hits issues of representation, the thing I'm really worried about, it sort of remains to be seen if it'll happen, is that without sort of sufficient support, theatres are going to have to get really conservative in their programming. They're going to have to sort of commit to things that are saleable or perceived to be saleable, you know, the things that are a sure thing. And that sort of has an inertial conservatism to it, which is the stuff we know sells, which is the stuff we've done before, which is the stuff which is less likely to bear witness to what Ireland is actually like right now. So because Ireland has been represented as white, it will continue to be represented as white for economic sort of, because of economic contingency. Equally, I sort of think there's lots of really exciting, brave companies out there who are really on board to have the conversation about let's do new things, let's do exciting things. Because I think that's why I was insisting, you know, on that difference between, you know, things that are saleable and things that are perceived to be saleable. Because I think sometimes we get caught in this myth that like everybody just wants to see Shakespeare all the time, whether it's a good production or a terrible production. But really interestingly, I was talking to a producer of quite a big company a while back, and he was saying that the best season they've had in a while was the season they programmed of all new writing. And yeah, so like I sort of have my fingers crossed that as we're rethinking pretty much everything, we'd rethink things in the ways we need to. But I'm very conscious that there's another sort of big pothole that we might just drive into and blow up in, if that's an answer. How about you?
I mean, I totally agree, Dylan. I also think like the funding in the arts has always been a challenge. It's always been a challenge for us. And I think when we're thinking about new audiences, I think the fact that we've gone into a digital age, that brings with it opportunity, but it also really highlights issues of access, because there are still large amounts of the population who can't access digital, you know, they don't have internet. You know, for anybody that's got literacy issues, there's access of being, you know, there's access issues in terms of even just being able to log on to be able to see work, or being able to find out where that there's interesting work happening, you know, just being able to, you know, on a real basic level access. But I think that there is lots of opportunities. What I've seen is a real opportunity for internationalism, which I think is in lots of ways is good. There's a great way of being able to connect artists across the globe to be able to make work and to think together in a way that wasn't possible before. You know, we didn't, I'm even thinking about myself sometimes traveling across the water to go to a meeting because it was really important. And I think, like, I still like face-to-face work. And I think the arts often is about just being in the room, like connecting with other people in that kind of way. And that's something that you can't really do digitally. I mean, you know, there's lots of opportunity in it. I think when we're trying to reach hard to reach communities in terms of making work, and I do that quite a lot, and my practice has been affected in lots of ways there, because often we work in some really sensitive ways, and being able to create real trust in a digital circle is sometimes much more difficult than it is when you're in the room and people get to see who you are and get the measure of who you are. And you know, that kind of work has to be done over a longer period of time. And actually just being able to create theatre, be able to create the drama online, it's given us an opportunity to really expand our practice and to think about how we work. And so, yeah, it's a blessing and a curse, I guess.
I'd love to jump on that, actually, because I think there's something potentially really salutary about lockdown and COVID conditions for that sort of situated work you're talking about, which is getting used to the idea that, because most people right now, you know, sort of their survival needs are front and center in a way that they aren't a lot of the time for enabled people, you know, and that's a really good thing, because sometimes I think when people decide for the first time that they want to make socially engaged art or to make work with a community, they sort of, they're coming with lots of baggage from the professional or the standard model of theatre production in terms of, and this is the time frame we'll do it on, but actually really making a show that's respectful and listens and sort of learns from the people it's supposed to be speaking to. That's a really slow process. And it has to move at the speed of the community involved, you know, who very often have more important stuff to be doing. I was working on a show a couple of years back with young people through Focus Ireland, and in the end we had really hoped that we could make the show and that they would be the cast, you know, the service users we were working with, and at the end of the day they were just like, no, sorry, I mean, we've got too much survival stuff on, and you sort of have to respect that rather than going around going, sake, kicking things, you've ruined my show, do you know? And I think I think, yeah, maybe lockdown is a good object lesson in the need to go to where the people are rather than expecting the people to come to you, and to work on their terms rather than your terms, because I think we're all getting used to having to do that for everyone, you know, like people who are immunocompromised or what have you, you know. We're getting better at that dialogue about needs and the idea that needs are idiosyncratic.
There's a few other questions here, and one of them actually, and it's a part 2 of the question, but is theatre's essence now more broken as a result of being in a digital space? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes there's because, you know, we talk about theatre as the live art form or the live performance, as opposed to, you know, the film, which is the thing that happens once and then it keeps existing. And I think I'm a bit wary sometimes of this slightly fetishized version of liveness, which is about edginess and in-your-faceness, and which for me sometimes feels faker than, you know, a show that just is a show. They sort of break your nose off the fourth wall because, you know, you're so close to the performers, you can see them sweating and like pretending to have sex with each other, but also they're pretending you're not there. And there's something about that feels really inconsistent and actually sort of not what's most interesting about liveness, which is that mutual regard, the fact that you can see me and I can see you. And for me, that isn't always just about being in the same room. That's sort of more about time and the agreed time. And, you know, I sort of think Alison Spittle's sort of co-video party has been really interesting that way, because it's sort of reinstated the logic of teletimes, you know, which is we all get together and we all watch the same thing at the same time and we're in a dialogue, you know, via Twitter or something. So that's sort of, for me, more theatrical sometimes than theatre that casts you as this sort of mute, abject spectator that happens to be in the room as other people who you're not supposed to be allowed perceive. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and you know what, I mean, I feel quite excited even by that question, because actually it brings me to, like, what even is theatre? What's mainstream? Like, who puts the kite mark to that? Who says what theatre is? Like, you know, we know about all the theories, and I've been really careful because, you know, I'm a theatre maker, I work in the theatre.
Yeah.
But like sometimes I'm in a supermarket and I'm watching theatre. You know, it's there right in front of us. And sometimes I even question, is this invisible theatre? Because it feels so live, it feels so participatory, it feels so like almost like there's moments that I feel like a voyeur in, you know, in those kind of moments. And when we think about mainstream, having even the titles of mainstream suggests another and an alternative. Like, you know, what even is mainstream? Now, one of the other questions that was asked, Dylan, is, and somebody has said that, you know, they believe that you once asked a question in the past, who gets to tell what stories in reference to otherness? And you know, and Jack is stating that it's very vague, but what do we both think about that? You know, whose story is who? Whose story isn't somebody's? Who gets to tell whose stories? And is it even important? Is it important? Sorry, I'm smiling because Stephen is laughing, and it is Bow Wow's work. It is Bow Wow's work in the supermarket. I work a lot with people who identify as being oppressed. So I work with the theatre of oppression, but like thinking about who makes what work. Because what I often think, Dylan, is that there are people who sometimes undervalue people's excellence. When people are bringing their work to the table and they're bringing their lived experience, I sometimes challenge why people might believe that it's not good enough. Like, how can it not be good enough when it's their work? It's their real work. They're telling their story. And equally, when we watch work or we see work that's been created by people who represent, or who are representing a story that is not their story, and sometimes they do it really badly. And you know, when we think about work that's been made for, you know, we're thinking about inclusion and representation, I think that question is really fundamental when we're thinking about the bigger picture. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really fundamental question that you sort of have to ask every time you go to make a project, and you sort of have to ask it from first principles every time. I think I sort of like to complement it with the flip question, which is less about the person making it, because then you sort of end up in this weird logic of feeling like you have to present your credentials, you know, which is, well, I'm allowed to do this because X, Y, Z, blah, blah, blah. And maybe sort of the more useful question sometimes is, who is it for? And where's it going to go on? And who's going to see it? And what are they going to take from it? Because, you know, I think what is so powerful about writing and art generally is the power to speak across difference and speak to difference, and to navigate it, rather than sort of locking you into yourself. But the way to do that respectfully is to think sort of about the eventual audience you're going to have. So I think you can write characters who aren't you once you've done so respectfully, once you're really open to receiving really negative feedback from people who know what they're talking about better than you do. You know, if someone tells you, that's not what I sound like, you sort of have to take that on board. You know, that's not what people who share my experience sound like. You'd be stupid not to take that on board. And then, yeah, I think, you know, you get into the really complex territory of even people who mean really well and have every right to tell a story. Sometimes you then put it into a forum, a theatre where the audience are going to be really different from, you know, sort of the people who are featured in the play or the people who are on the stage. In a way that means probably when there's a joke, they're going to laugh for the wrong reason. I mean, the classic one for me sort of was when, you know, in the script of a play of mine, there's a performance note at the start, which is saying there are jokes in this play in a Dublin accent. You should ideally stage the play in a way that it's really clear that the Dublin accent is never the joke. And I sort of felt like that was worth spelling out, you know, because, yeah, you sort of have to bear in mind, you know, the typical demographic of your typical, or demographics of your typical theatre audience, you know. So yeah, thinking about who's going to see it under what circumstances and who's going to feel welcome in the building where it's going to be seen, that often gives you a sense of whether it's your place to tell that story. Yeah, that's sort of where I'd come at from.
And I would also just kind of add to that, it's about, because I think it is important that people tell the stories of the communities that they see. And sometimes that's not your direct experience, but if people don't tell those stories, sometimes those stories are never heard. But I would ask people to kind of question why they're telling those stories. Like, what is it, you know, because sometimes people feel like, you know, people have probably heard of the Beckys, but, you know, people are thinking about wanting to be like almost like a savior. And so wanting to fix this problem or wanting to shine a light on. And so that's never really a great reason. But I think that it is really important that people are looking for their inspiration around them, looking at the stories that they want to tell, and thinking if, you know, when they're looking at the story, is this story representative of the place, of the people that they're talking about? And if it's not, you know, like if you're writing a play about Dublin, what does that Dublin look like? Because right now, if that Dublin looks like, you know, that it's monotone, then that's not a fair representation of Dublin. And so it's important that our stories are telling, you know, real life stories. And Dylan, I think that we, like, one of the things that you and I have talked about, and I just think, just in case that there happens to be a funder listening, what feels great for me about working at Access is Access Arts for me is one of, you know, and I'm saying one of a few because there are a few others, but it's one of the few spaces that I know that really does what it says on the tin. It is a space that really works with artists, that often helps to fund work for people to create themselves as artists, to create the work, sometimes collaboratively with the company. But I think we'd be losing a trick actually, because I feel like what's really important is that funders work with us as artists as well as organizations to look at the work that we're creating. When we're thinking about representation, look at who's doing great work and work with us on creating projects rather than us always having to reinvent the wheel. Because sometimes I think that, you know, we can be doing great work. And I think now more than ever, with this new digital world, we need to find other ways of being able to work and other ways of being able to collaborate. And you touched on it before, you know, that the arts is underfunded. So how do we continue to change the landscape that is the arts? And I'm coming back to something that I said earlier, when we're looking at the fact that as artists, we often just want to do things as free. And some of the ways that we connect with companies is sometimes by volunteering or taking part in projects. But what that often means is when we're looking at representation, particularly when we're looking at artists that come from low economic backgrounds, there's a trick that's missed because people just can't afford to volunteer. People can't afford to give up their time. You know, you'll find people working in bars, working as waitresses, working in jobs that they can still go for an audition or something, because they still often need to work outside of creating. And I think that there isn't an artist alive that hasn't experienced doing something else in order to pay the bills while we're trying to be creative, why we're trying to be innovative, why we're trying to connect, why we're trying to do all of this other kind of work. And it feels really basic to me that if we really want to place value on representation in Irish arts and culture and have all members of Irish society represented, then work really needs to be funded in a way that gives us space to be able to make that work. And sometimes that means that that work can take a longer process. If you're working in an area, if you're working with people who speak English as an additional language, sometimes that has to be taken into a planning process in order to be able to create that kind of work. And so that work needs to be funded in a way that's representative of that piece of work. Dylan, I know that you also have thoughts about this, so I'm going to just hand over to you because I could go on about this all night, actually.
Yeah, I mean, the thing to say up front is access are fab. And then to be a bit more detailed about that is to say one of the reasons they're fab is because they're really good at long-term thinking, in the sense of doing this right is gonna be slower than just we pay you or we commission you to write the play and then 6 months later or 18 months later it exists. It's gonna involve a little more wiggle and exploration and collaboration, and so I think that's what they're really good at, is because, I've been working with Dublin Fringe the last little while to try and get this initiative going, which is sort of peer mentorship and support for Irish artists of colour and Black artists. It's just really slow, because deadlines come and deadlines go and deadlines get postponed and this, that and the other. And that's sort of fine, because in the meantime, you just go off and you learn more about who's already doing stuff and who's already doing it for free, and you make the connections and you play what if and you rethink from first principles rather than it should be 3 shows, made by 3 deadly makers. You sort of go, well, maybe the more valuable thing there is sort of a peer network of artists. And sorry, that's the thing, which is it's not just me and Fringe, it's me and Fringe and the Deadly crew at Origin Zella who've been working on that, So yeah, I think, where am I going with that? Just that thing that, yeah, for me, it comes back to that distinction I think that I mentioned earlier between, I suppose, sort of expecting people to come to you and need to meet people where they are and to make the type of work they want to see right now, rather than, I suppose, your preconceived idea of what is excellent work that happens to feature people of colour or working class people or what have you, which is, so yeah, for me, it's not just about bodies on stages, it's about bodies choosing what story they're telling on that stage. And that sort of maybe is related to that other thing between, a good job for a good actor of an experience versus good stories for that community, you know? Because like Romeo and Juliet, you know, or no, that's a, or King Lear. King Lear is a great role, you know. You can cross-cast it. You could cast a woman in that role. You could cast, you know, a black King Lear, even though Lear is not, you know, explicitly white. Reading between the lines, he is, and that is a good job. Whereas probably the more interesting thing to do is, or I think possibly the more meaningful thing to do in terms of building an artistic community who will produce works of their own, responding to our moment, our distinctive moment, distinctively, is to invest in the artists rather than at production. And that just sort of involves a longer, thinkier, messier process. And I think that's the sort of thing that Access are really like. You bring them something like that and they go, yeah, cool, big thumbs up. Or that's certainly been my experience. And that's sort of really heartening when you're in the early days of going, oh God, what am I doing?
No, I mean, that's what draws me to Access. And it's not, you know, we happen to be on this platform tonight. And I have to say, it's not, well, I know, certainly speaking from self, I'm not saying this because I'm taking part, you know, in something on an Access space. I truly mean this. Like, Access is my home away from home, and Access really is open to, you know, and accessible for people to come into that space. But I do know that, you know, some of the conversations that we've certainly been having at Access are about, you know, the wider Dublin community, and looking at opportunities and why people are not putting themselves forward for opportunities. So Dylan, what do you think? Because do you think that as artists that we have a duty to be able to elevate our community and to think about how we are representing the wider Irish society when we're thinking about who we are as makers?
Yeah, I really feel that sort of motive in myself, or that desire, even as, you know, maybe linking that back to something about we were talking about a moment ago, which is a huge red flag or thing that sets off an alarm bell is my head, is the phrase, you know, when I hear an artist talk about giving people a voice, because I think that arrogates an importance to art generally, and specifically your art, that it doesn't really merit, which is the idea that you have the power to bestow a voice upon someone, and that actually far more often what is the case is they already have a voice and just no one's listening to them. And in a way, if you think of them as silent, that probably says more about your listening abilities than it does about their articulacy or their intellectual or artistic powers. And so related to that, to elevate, yeah, I don't know. Because again, you know, representation I think is really important, you know, that on a really simple economic level, you know, there's economic repercussions if you can't get a job because, you know, you're an actor of color who never gets called for anything but like bad servant role in lesser known Tennessee Williams play. You know, like if that's your only casting, that has the potential to, you know, like affect your ability to pay your bills. And then, you know, like more broadly and philosophically, you need to see your experience reflected in order to help yourself understand it and everything. So I think, yeah, increasing inclusion is a thing we should be conscious of as writers or makers or artists, you know, which is adequately representing the really big, complex, diverse, hybrid world we live in. But like, are you elevating people when you do that? Or are you just doing your job? You know, are you just insisting that the world is as complex as it is? Are you refusing to tell lies that make people clap and then go home? You know, are you doing the hard thing? Are you telling, you know, the unpalatable truths, which is, I think, the thing we love to say we do, but actually most of the time don't. My pal Shanny Weary makes theatre for young audiences, and I think she's really enjoyably sort of caustic about this, which is she's like, you're not an activist if you write a play with a black person in it. You're doing your job. Black people exist. You should write plays about them. That's how it works. You don't get a medal. You don't get a cookie. You don't get a pat on the back. You're doing your job. You know, you're not Martin Luther King.
Yeah, and it's kind of equally is that we're not saying like we're making work for this person. We're making work because we're making work, and work should represent what we see around us. So we're coming quite close to the end of this evening's chat, which is like quite, you know, it's not, there's so many things that we could be talking about. So Dylan, before that we finish up this evening, is there anything else that you feel like is really important that you just add to the conversation? There might not be, but anything that we haven't talked about tonight that you think like it's really important for me to just say this?
God, yeah. I think, yeah, I mean, it's not my thought. I've seen a lot of people saying it, and I think it's potentially, again, one of the good things that might come from this crisis, you know, which is the way it's made us reflect on what was before, and the fact that the state of affairs that obtained before COVID sort of kicked in was also a crisis. Things weren't fine before. We shouldn't want to go back to that. The arts, you know, in particular, things were really constrained. Lots of people were really, really exploited, and they weren't sustainable. And I suppose the way that touches on access and representation specifically is the thought that I saw someone share recently that the representation you really want from the art you consume is already out there. It's just not being made by famous people. It's just not being made by millionaires. It's just not on Netflix. And I think part of the reason for the crisis before was we'd sort of gotten quite far down this road of like the Netflixification or the touristification of the arts, you know, which is the idea that only the stuff that's huge, only the stuff that blows up globally, only the stuff that breaks the internet has value, and that representation is only taking place in arts, and we're only reflecting on what it's like to be queer. We're only reflecting on what it's like to be working class. We're only reflecting on what it's like to be Black or a person of color, you know, when we see it in those huge things, on these hyper spectacles, you know, created by millionaires in readily giftable form. But actually, art is really big, art is really messy. There's loads of smaller stuff out there. And very often the really cool, really deadly, really weird, really interesting, really truthful stuff is just small. And actually, truth doesn't scale very well. The second you try to scale it up and make it shinier, the first thing that goes is its integrity. And so I suppose in that way, I'm sort of really interested in the idea of everybody getting comfortable with the idea of local art again. And because local, it's specific, and because specific, it's truthful. And that's something worth, that's a skid worth steering into for me. So yeah, the radical, cool, interesting, truthful rep you're looking for already exists. It's just not being made by millionaires. That's sort of a thought I think is really good.
And I think it's a really important one. That feels like, you know, such a great thought to be finishing up with, because, you know, when we think, Dylan, about the narratives that there are about the arts, because for me, growing up as a child, for me, the arts was elitist. Coming to London, I thought to see theatre, it had to be in the West End. I didn't know about Fringe. I didn't know about all the other kinds of theatre. You know, or even when as a child, when we put on plays in school, it didn't have value. And it's looking at how we how we value all contributions in a way that we want to see it, that we want to acknowledge it, that we want to applaud it. Thank you very much, Dylan, for coming this evening to talk to us. We'll continue to have lots of conversations. Thank you very much to those of you that are at home that are joining us this evening. I'm going to be back next week, Wednesday, with another guest, and I'll be here for the next 8 weeks. Please come back and speak to us again. If there's any questions that you have for us, let us know. We're more than happy to answer questions. And I think one of the things that's really important, Dylan, and you know, is the kind of honesty that we've brought to the conversation this evening. I think that there are many times that people have things to say, they have questions, and they just don't know where to bring them or how to ask them. And the spaces that I always want to create are spaces that equalize us and give people an opportunity to be heard and to say what they want to say and to be listened to. And so any questions that anyone does have, please bring them. This is the space for it. We're really looking at identity other. Please do have a look on the Access website. There's so much things happening for the Access bootleg season. It's really exciting. There's so many great artists. So that's it from us this evening. Thank you so much for being here with us. And I look forward to seeing you again next week, Wednesday. Bye for now.